So in this lesson, we're going to dive in and recreate our volume scrubbing bar. So we can adjust the volume, and we haven't looked at this property yet, but it's pretty self-explanatory. So let's go ahead and dive in. Underneath our player progress, we're then going to create a new div. We can give this a class. I'm going to call this the player __ sound. So inside here, we're going to have a nice icon as well as another input type range. So first we're going to create the image source, and we're also going to give this a class. For this, we're just going to call this the player __ mute, and this is essentially going to be our volume icon. Underneath, we can create an input type with a value of range and a class. I'm going to call this the player __ volume. So we're going to have a few query selectors here and then start to bind some events and also change our volume icon. So, much like our input type range on our timeline, we also want a min, max value, and we're going to keep these exactly the same. Now, instead of having a value of 0, we're going to have a value of 100. So this is going to essentially dictate the volume level by default. So let's save this out, and we then have a new slider, and we need to now add the volume icon as well as some styling to our particular volume. Now for this, we're going to bind a variable, and we're going to call this the volume icon. So let's jump up above, go and import our volume icon, and this is going to just be called volume.svg. Now what I also want, because we're going to change this, we're going to toggle it essentially to a mute icon. So if you go and import volume-mute as well, we can then start using both of these depending on what we actually click. Now, for the moment, we don't need the volume mute, so I'm just going to comment it out to prevent any linting errors. So, before we go any further, let's go and add some styling to our new marker. If you want to save it out, you can then see the updated volume in our DOM, so let's go and add some basic styles. Now, if you jump down to the bottom, we can say player __, and our container div is called the sound. Now, for this, we just have a few rules. We have display flex, align items with a value of center, a nice easy width of 80 pixels. Now we're going to use margin-left auto to essentially push it over to the right. So let's save this out, and you can see that it gives us a nice inline volume slider. We can then adjust the volume accordingly. Now you can see that the volume is actually at the end. So every time I refresh, our volume is essentially set to the maximum. So what we need to do now, when we go and click on our particular volume icon, we want to bind an event listener and then start adjusting it. So there's two things we want to do. One, when we click on the volume icon, we want to mute it, which is why we've imported our mute icon. And we also want to bind another range event to allow the user to then adjust the volume accordingly. So let's first add the behavior to our player _volume. So let's jump down underneath our player duration. We can change this over to player _volume. So we now have a query selector reference to our volume type range. That's this one, where we have a nice easy step of 0 to 100 to help us set the volume quite easily. So let's jump down to our event listeners. Let's say volume. And again, we want to use the input event. And again, we want to use the input event. And we'll create a function called the set volume. So this is nice and easy. We'll grab our reference to our function. We can say const set volume. This then gives us an event because it's exactly the same as above where we have our skip to position, which means that we get the event.target.value. So we can say const position because again, it's going to be the position of where we've selected. So we'll keep the naming conventions the same. And we can say we want to parse that integer of the event.target.value. And much like above, we also want to divide it by 100. So if we console.log our position, we can save this out, and then we'll look at how to actually set the volume. So you can see that we have a number from 0 to 1, and the decimal places essentially dictate the percentage of how far we've scrubbed along the timeline. So I hear you ask, how do we set this new volume? Well, actually, it's quite simple. We haven't looked at this yet, but we have a media.volume. And we can just simply set that to our new position. So if we press play, let's start dragging this. And that seems to work absolutely perfectly. So this volume property allows us to simply set. We then calculate the percentage. And because our volume goes from 0 to 1, that's why we are dividing it by 100, because 1 is the maximum volume on our volume property. So if we go console.log, log out our volume, once we've set it, we can in fact see that number. So the volume is not 1 to 100, it's a 0 to 1 value, which is why we are, again, dividing it by 100. So let's now add the functionality to toggle when we click on our volume. We want to essentially mute or unmute it. So let's jump up and create another selector. Here we want to target our volume image that we have above. So if we look here, we've got our volume icon, and that has a class of player_mute. So let's call this the volume toggle and change this over to player__mute. So the volume toggle will then allow us to bind an event listener. So obviously we want to bind some kind of click. So let's say volume toggle add event listener will bind a click event. And then here we want to toggle the volume. So let's take our toggle volume. We can create a constant toggle volume. Now we don't need to use the event object that's coming through, so we'll just leave the arguments completely empty. So there are a few things that we want to do inside of here. We want to check if the volume is already muted and then essentially toggle the value depending on that. So let's first say, is the volume muted? Now for this, we're just going to simply check the media.volume and see if that value equals 0, because as we just experimented, this goes from 0 to 1. So if it's muted, it's 0. So this tells us whether we've in fact muted that value already, which means that now we have a reference to our image, we can just simply swap it out. So we can say volume toggle dot source. We're going to now set our new icon. However, we need to go and change our imports. So for this, we're going to use a ternary statement. If it's muted, then we want to use our volume icon. Otherwise, we need to use this muted icon. Now, at the moment, we have this commented out. So let's take the value and uncomment it. And we want to jump down and set the mute icon if we are not muted. So let's save this out and see what it gives us. So now when we click, we can see that we have our icon, which has now been changed to our mute icon, which looks quite nice. The UI has been updated accordingly. Now, one interesting thing, if we go and console log out our volume, let's check it out. So at the moment, we can click and it sets it to 1 because at this point in time, our volume is full. So when the value is 1, we are not muted, and therefore we set the mute icon because we're then setting that muted state. Now, because we're not actually changing the volume level here, it actually gets stuck. You can see I'm clicking here and we're just simply logging out in the console that value of 1. Now, this is because our volume bar has not been changed. We can, however, drag it all the way back down to 0, and you can see that we can then toggle the value of 0. We can drag it above 1, and you can see that whatever value we choose keeps it as muted. It doesn't toggle it back. We can, of course, go back to 0, and then it toggles it back. So what we need to do for this is dispatch a new event whilst setting the new value. So let's get rid of our console log. Underneath our toggle for the image source, we're going to then set the value on our actual input. And this will also introduce something quite interesting for us. So first, let's say volume.value. And again, we want to check whether we are muted. If we are muted, we want to set the value back to 100. Otherwise, we're going to mute it, which is why we have volume is going to give us 100, and we're going to mute it when we're at 0. So this is a nice inline ternary that we can perform this logic with. So let's save this out. We can click on the volume. You can see that it mutes it. If we click again, we're actually seeing the behavior that we do not desire. We're not actually seeing the value being reflected. Now, there are two ways that we can do this. The first is to dispatch an input event on our volume, which is then going to call our set volume itself. So let me demonstrate both of these and you can decide which way you want to go. So we can say volume, dispatch event, and this is a DOM method, and we can pass a new event and fire the input event. So what we're essentially doing is setting the value and then we're telling the JavaScript engine that we are essentially firing an input event on our volume control. So when we now click, you can see that it toggles nicely. This is because we have our volume event listener. So what's happening is we're setting the value programmatically with JavaScript. Whereas if we actually click ourselves, our event listener is firing. So this is allowing us to, behind the scenes, manually fire that event when we are toggling the volume via a click event. So that's one way that we could do it. The other way is we could say media.volume equals, and we can say, are we muted? Then we want to set the volume to 1. Otherwise, we're going to set it to 0. So I've commented out our manual event. We can now toggle things accordingly, and you can also see the HTML5 volume icon is muting accordingly as well. So let's play this out. And you can see that this mutes it as we'd expect. If we try both of our methods, so we can dispatch our input event, we can hit play again. And there you have it. So we've now implemented the custom setting of the particular volume level. Not only this, we've allowed us to toggle our UI accordingly based on the volume that we select. Now there's one thing that you can see when we are muted and I drag this, our volume icon doesn't actually recognize that we are unmuting manually. So what we could do is jump into our volume where we have this set volume callback, and we could run the exact same logic here. So if we are muted, then we want to use our volume icon, but we're not going to use is muted. We're going to check that the volume is actually greater than 0. So when we save this out, we can mute and then drag, and you can see that it unmutes or mutes our volume source. And beforehand, if we commented this out, you can see that when we drag this down to 0, the HTML5 is actually showing the mute icon, but ours isn't. So we've tied them in nicely. They're both in line. The volume here is loud, so any time that the volume is greater than 0, we can then toggle and display that mute icon, and everything here is nice and synchronized. So I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a really nice API. I love dealing with these APIs and then creating functionality like this alongside some of the native new inputs, such as the input type of range. So that's it for this lesson. We've covered quite a lot. We've also looked at dispatching events when we want to programmatically set a volume level. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Let's dive into the next one where we're going to investigate some different APIs like full screen as well as picture in picture.